people seem to think that the moment Reagan represented is the moment that we live in now. And in many ways, it's not. Our problems are economic, but different in the sense that we're living in a digital market, but also an incredibly concentrated market where you have banks cutting off people over their ideology. All of those things, I think, are going to require new and innovative and creative solutions that I think can fit within the bounds of conservatism. Our principles were made for this. Our principles were made to be flexible and resurgent in moments where the conditions have changed.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. You are in for a treat this week. I would like to think that's true every week because we have such great guests. But my friend and policy and conservative colleague, Rachel Bovard, who's the Senior Policy Director at the Conservative Partnership Institute, is with me here this week. We're going to talk about big tech, conservatism, the new right, the imminent conservative majority in D.C., maybe even 2024. We'll probably even get into some trouble, meaning we're going to talk about conservative stuff this week. But let me be quiet for a moment, and thank you, Rachel, for making time.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
And you're also a Heritage alumna. And so since then, you have gone on to a great partner organization, partner in the conservative movement, where we do some things together, especially when it comes to staff training, articulating a future for conservatism. But before we get into some of the details of that, especially on the policy side, how is it that you got into this work? Because you also spent several years working on the Hill.
Actually, it's an interesting and pointed question because I got my start in politics in many ways right here in this lobby. I was a Heritage intern way back in 2004. And in this lobby, I met Margaret Thatcher and
Really?
Clarence Thomas. And yeah, I think I was maybe 19 or 20 at the time, and it was just wild for me in that moment. I, grew up in a super small town. I did my undergrad at Grove City College, which is probably familiar to many of your listeners, but also a very small school. Had no plans to go into politics. I was a history major. I thought maybe I'll go to law school, and had a professor who became a mentor of mine, Dr. Paul Kengor, who was like, hey, I was his research assistant on a number of books, and he was like, you should try politics. And I'd never heard of the Heritage Foundation, and he was like, start there. And that's kind of what kicked off my career. Politics seemed really fun. And from undergrad, I went to Capitol Hill for 10 years, and it's been a wild and crazy ride ever since.
Well, and since that time, you wouldn't take credit for this other than maybe being a super Twitter troll, which is how you suggested I introduce you. But while that is true, and I'm glad you're on our side, the compliment I was going to give you is that you're one of the most insightful writers in the conservative movement. And
thank you.
No, I mean that. It's heartfelt, and hopefully people already know about you and your work, but if they don't, they should. And so we'll talk about some of the recent things that you've written. But where I wanted to start in terms of policy is that last few weeks we had the Federal Communications Commission Commissioner, Brendan Carr, on, and we talked about problems with big tech. Mm-hmm. And that episode has gotten a lot of traction because I think a lot of people in the audience were surprised that someone who is an FCC commissioner would be as quote unquote radical as he is. He's that concerned about both the economic consequences of what we've allowed big tech to do, but also the social and cultural consequences. You've written about both. But let's just start there with that really big project of reforming the problem that is big tech. What do we need to know, and where do we start to reform it?
So it's a big question, and I'm also a big fan of Commissioner Carr. I think he really sees the depth and breadth of this problem. And I think it really starts at a 40,000 foot level of how much technology has changed the way that we live and interact and how fast that has happened. I don't think people really appreciate that the speed and scale at which the technological revolution in the digital space has happened. What I mean by that is that, tech has changed not just how we interact and how we speak, but how we shop, how we vote, how we gather information, how we relate to our families, how we learn. Every area of our lives has been impacted in some ways by these giant tech companies that now represent sort of the tech space. Even the market, as we've always understood it, is different now because, traditional analog market understandings don't necessarily apply to the digital space where you're not constrained necessarily by brick and mortar. And so questions of scale become very significant in ways that you wouldn't have in a traditional market scenario. So, up until this digital revolution, if you think about it, like the mirror was a big technological advancement, right? And suddenly we've just sped up this pace in a very dramatic way. And our public policy really hasn't kept pace with that. And in some ways that's by design, right? Policy chases innovation in this country in a way that has made us the tip of the spear, right? The iPhone was invented here for a reason. But I think you also reach a tipping point, and we are at that point, I think, and I think a lot of people would agree if you spend any time looking at it, that it is now time for our policy to impact this space, because we've reached a point where these technology firms in many cases are ruling us in ways that have become deeply uncomfortable and I think deeply unsustainable for a self-government, for a democratic society. And when you get to that point, that's when the self-government responds. And it says, okay, how do we preserve the things that made this strong while also respecting how this technology relates to a free and democratic people? And I think that's where we are right now.
And so to pick up with the conversation that I had with Commissioner Carr, and I'm sure that you've had with him regarding some of the tensions, the philosophical tensions inside the conservative movement that have been obstacles, frankly, to heritage. We've been very open about this with our one voice policy. It took us a while to figure out where we wanted to land on confronting the big tech problem. As I tell people, that isn't anything we should be embarrassed about. We should actually, we and other organizations like yours who've been advancing the idea of reform on big tech should be proud that we're getting there as a movement. There's more work to be done. But where I want to go with that is, as we record this, it's pretty clear there's going to be, in at least one chamber of the U.S. Congress, a conservative majority. Do you think that the leadership in that chamber, and perhaps the Senate, we don't know what has gone on with the election yet, if it is conservative, will be able to overcome those tensions inside conservatism, namely that there are still people who look at the free market as an altar to be bowed to, rather than a very good symptom of a very healthy society, for the purposes of reforming the big tech problem?
They're not there yet. And that is my candid assessment. And it's interesting because the base is very much there. I think it is my observation that the conservative base is very ready to take on big tech and does not see any sort of clash between the idea that we need to preserve a free market but also act against tech. They don't see that as a cognitive dissonance in a way, I think. But elected Republicans are always a lagging indicator, again, of where the base is. And that's, again, I think by design.
It's a good reminder.
Yeah, but it's also by design, because in this country, we rule from the bottom up. We don't rule from the top down. So, I think they are still trying to get over what I think is plaguing the political right in this moment, which you alluded to it, which is this ideology of the market that I think has really ossified into a dogma that is not helpful right now. And what I mean by that is, I think conservatism as a philosophy, conservatism as a worldview has always looked at the market not as an end to itself, but as a means to a meaningfully free life, right? And in many ways, for the last 30 years or so, the market was a solver of a lot of our problems. I think in the Reagan era, you can argue that was definitely true. We had a very sclerotic economy. You needed a lot of that deregulation and a lot of market functioning to overcome that. Those things are still important, but I make a distinction between the market and the massive multinational corporations that exist within it. That's not the market. Those corporations are not the market. And so, to exact some rules of the road for how those companies interact with the market and us, to me, is not sort of, quote unquote, the heavy hand of the government. It is simply sort of this Lockean idea of actually creating the space for all of us to associate in the market in a free manner. And I don't think that exists right now.
No, it doesn't. And it seems as if, to borrow your phrase, that, and your candid assessment, political leadership in Washington is not there yet. There's some work to do. That if someone watching or listening to this episode is asking, well, what can I do? It would be to draw that distinction between these multinational corporations, frankly, who don't even see themselves as American corporations first. It should be a huge affront to all of us across the political spectrum, but drawing a distinction between them and the free market, which would be most commonly, just thinking about the commercial transactions in this country, between one person and a very small business. And I think the more conservatives can do that, the better we're off. And just by extension, I think that also underscores another reality in the conservative movement, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and that is the emergence of conservatism as more of an everyday working class American kind of movement. It's always been that way. You know the history of that well, but I think it's really important for us to re-embrace those origins of the movement. I don't want to talk about that yet because there's another question about big tech I want to ask.
Sure.
Section 230. Coming up in the Supreme Court.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
So Section 230.
Where do we start?
Oh my gosh, I know. It's like so much light and heat and Sturm und Drang around this. So Section 230, for people that are unfamiliar, is this 26 words that quote unquote created the internet. But simply all it did in 1996, it was passed and envisioned as a way to incentivize these companies to moderate content. And what I mean by that is get rid of the stuff people don't want to see. It was conceived as a way to literally protect kids from pornography on the internet, right? And to incentivize these companies to remove that content, but not be sued for it. So it created this immunity that I have argued in many places, and I think Commissioner Carr probably has too, that it has been completely stretched and contorted by the courts to cover all manner of sins. I mean, you literally have Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, arguing in court that Section 230 protects them from sex traffickers, pushing 14 and 15-year-old girls into sex slavery. That was never the intent of the law. And so it's a component of the tech law that many of us have focused on as a way to rein in these companies, to make them more accountable for how they manage speech on these platforms. And I think the basic reality of it is it was a statute that was blown out of proportion by the courts and needs to be reined back in. Now, the Supreme Court has taken up Gonzalez v. Google, which is not a clear Section 230 question, but deals specifically with algorithmic amplification, right? In this specific case, you're dealing with how the platforms treated ISIS content, right? So you're dealing with, does Section 230 protect the platforms when they're dealing with content created by terrorists?
Talking about real terrorists.
Real terrorists,
not just the domestic terrorists who are parents of public school kids.
Not the ones protesting school boards,
right? Yeah, that's right.
But you may have, I think, another case that comes up before the Supreme Court dealing with the Texas social media law, which basically bars the platforms from engaging in viewpoint discrimination. And you actually have a split on the Fifth Circuit and the 11th Circuit. And generally, conventional wisdom holds that when there's a split between those circuits, the Supreme Court will try to address that question. Now, that's a very clear Section 230 question. Congress has proven itself unable to deal with this question. So we're sort of looking at the Supreme Court to say, will you solve this problem? Now, I think it's interesting because Justice Clarence Thomas has opined very openly about Section 230, saying, yes, the courts may have just completely distorted this, and it's incumbent upon us to clarify that it's a very limited immunity rather than a very broad one. So we'll see.
And timing on that is in terms of learning about the outcome of those cases next summer, right? Summer of 2023.
Likely, yeah.
Okay. So in the meantime, there may be some other state legislative action, perhaps some action in the U.S. House. We'll see. But I have not sensed a cohesiveness among enough conservatives in the House, although there are some great stalwarts who want to take action on 230 and some other issues. So
I will say one component of this that I was very glad to see is the states are taking so much action on this question. And in so many ways, the states are the tail that wags the federal dog, right? Like states push Congress to act on this issue. They push the federal courts to act. And I just want to applaud all the states that are doing that.
Oh, it's exciting on that issue and others, right? And that might be a perfect segue, so thank you, into another topic we wanted to cover, which is the future of conservatism. Mm-hmm. Often in commentary that you're part of, discussions about the so-called new right. And this is, to the extent that I can remember, the third time in the last 100 years there's been a new right. In the 1950s.
The new right keeps getting newer.
Yeah, that's right. Buckley at one point was a member of the new right. Russell Kirk, to his horror, was once called a member of the new right. I read an article of yours from last month where you talked about the new right, Reagan being part of the new right in the late 70s and 80s, and we have a new right today. We're going to get into that specifically, but I want to hang on this point before we do that you just made about state action. Because we will sometimes talk about federalism, mm-hmm. which still has meaning, but for most Americans, it's meaningless because it's used so often as sort of a buzzword. But I think what you're getting at is something much more powerful and specific, which is that state legislatures and governors are saying, we're going to tell Congress, we're going to demand what Congress do, which is precisely what the framers of the Constitution had in mind in most policy areas. Do you think we will see more of that in the near future?
I do. I think that the conservative movement in this moment, and this is, I'm very glad to see this, is embracing almost this radical federalism, which is to say, everybody's fed up with the government. They recognize that the Congress is just completely dysfunctional. And I think, the overreach of the Biden administration has really pushed governors and state attorneys general, and I would even say state treasurers, to engage where the federal government either cannot or has not. And so I'm really gratified by that. But the caveat I would add to this, though, is that so many in the conservative movement sometimes use that as an excuse, and they'll say, well, the states should handle it, and our hands are off. To some extent, that's right, up until the point where you realize that the left has aggressed so much that they do not intend to let red states live in peace, right? They do not intend to allow Governor DeSantis to go unmolested or unharassed. And so there is a federal role here, to the extent that it's protecting these red states. That is incumbent upon the conservative movement in Washington to pay very close attention to. You simply can't say, well, the state should deal with it and ignore it from there. We have to be vigilant in this moment in a way that we have never had to be before, because everything is so politicized in a way it hasn't been before.
In a way that very well-meaning conservatives have sort of ignored until recently. Is it your sense that as you write and speak and talk to groups privately as well, that more kind of rank and file conservatives recognize that? That, in other words, earlier in our conversation, you talked to about elected officials in D.C. as being lagging indicators. Is it your sense that where the base is, and we're not talking about knuckle draggers,
right?
We're talking about very well-educated, sophisticated Americans who are successful, but they're the base, that's where they are, and the elected officials will follow them? I'm looking for optimism here in the next decade.
I think that movement has been building for a while. And what I mean is, I think that there has been a growing, and I don't mean just recently, I would say probably for the last 20, 25 years, there's been a growing disconnect between the Republican base and the Republican elected majority or conference in Washington. And I think the first real movement that you saw in response to that from the voters was the Tea Party. And that was voters throwing up their hands and saying, you guys aren't listening. Get it, right? But I think what happened there was that a lot of the energy around the Tea Party, if you remember, that was really, I kind of came of age in the Tea Party moment. I started my career on Capitol Hill in 2006, but the elections, 2008, 2010, I was really caught up in that moment. People like to look back on it and say, no, it was just driven by the debt and deficit. That was part of it, but it was also a very visceral reaction to an attempt by the Republicans in Congress to pass amnesty. It was a very big response to Obamacare and wanting them to repeal Obamacare. And I think that energy got co-opted in Washington by maybe a willful attempt or just, by accident into a lot of things it wasn't. And so I think voters were like, you missed it. So the Tea Party was a shot across the bow. I think Republicans in Washington weren't responsive in ways voters wanted. So then I think they sent a nuclear bomb to Washington, and that was Donald Trump. That was you didn't get it the first time, so we're going to make sure you listen this time. And I think Trump has just created the most meaningful political realignment I may ever see in my lifetime. I was just talking about this yesterday, actually, over at CPI, how he has transformed both parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, in tremendous ways. And so I think there's an energy in Washington that's always, you have an entrenched group, the Washington establishment, let's just call them, that always wants to pretend that's not happening. They want to regress to the mean so badly.
It's so natural.
Yeah, right, that you can see it. They want to pretend the Trump moment never happened. They just want to get back to wars and campaign finance reform and, whatever else. They don't want to actually engage in the culture wars the way Donald Trump did. They don't want to deal with the wreckage, I would say, of globalism and neoliberalism and how that has just destroyed the center of the country. They don't want to admit that that was the result of policy choices that they engaged in and that they must now deal with. And so you're seeing that, like there's always that churn to like push back to that regression, regress to the mean. And I think the voters very much are prepared to not let that happen again. And I think if this new conservative majority is not responsive to that, they're going to toss him out. Like, I don't know how else to put it. Like this moment, I think, has to very viscerally reflect how the base feels threatened in ways they've never felt threatened before. They're looking to their legislators to respond to that.
It's that palpable. I mean, you know that from the work that you do. I know that from the work that I do, especially the travel around to spend time with everyday Americans. And you use the word realignment. And I know you mean that as both a sort of common sense term, but also a political science term. And both are correct. But I also want to get your feedback on a claim that I will make. And it's piggybacking on something that you just said, which I agree with. And I know you have mentioned this to incoming elected officials, and I have as well. If you miss this moment as conservatives, you can't count on any of us who've helped you get here. And therefore, there will be yet another realignment that probably will start looking like a very different political party structure, as absurd and fantastical and radical as that sounds. That's how fed up the American people are.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And this is what the reason I brought up the Tea Party and then Donald Trump and now is because I do think these are waves building on each other. It's moments that were missed by this conservative Republican establishment, however you want to call it in Washington. They missed those moments. They now have a chance to get it right. And I think this is you will always hear the phrase, right? This election is the most important election of my lifetime. Like every election is that, right? But I will say, I think the stakes of this election are the highest I've ever seen because of the destruction the left intends to wield if they ever have power again. And we've gotten a taste of that, I think, from the Democratic unified government that we've seen. And I think there's this belief among some Republicans in Washington that, well, if we just get power and, stop them for the next 2 years, that'll be enough. And it's no, right? The Republicans always learn the wrong lessons from these wave elections. And what I mean is, there's a wave election, they're ushered into power, and they're like, we have this mandate, look at our huge coalition, we're amazing. And it's like, guys, especially in this instance, they're not coming to you because you're good. They're coming to you because they want the beatings to stop. And not only that, they want to know that they are protected from ever being treated like that again. So it's not enough to just say, well, I've stopped what the other guy's doing. It's what is your vision to create a meaningfully free life for the people that you represent. And that's the piece I think we're missing. We don't, you've seen some people dabble in it. Senator Rick Scott very famously put out an agenda, and the reaction in Washington was like, how dare you have a free thought that we haven't controlled?
Some of the commentary was almost that explicit.
Yeah, no, it was. It's like I'm mocking it, but not really. Which is horrifying. But you need more, you need to see more of that, because the challenges that Republicans face now are really unlike any they've ever faced. I think the problem that we have with the sort of entrenched Reaganism is that people seem to think that the moment Reagan represented is the moment that we live in now. And in many ways, it's not. Well, I think in all ways, it's not. We're not fighting the Cold War, with Russia. We don't have one common enemy. Our problems are economic, but different in the sense that we're living in a digital market, but also an incredibly concentrated market where you have banks cutting off people over their ideology. So all of those things I think are going to require new and innovative and creative solutions that I think can fit within the bounds of conservatism. Our principles were made for this. Our principles were made to be flexible and resurgent in moments where the conditions have changed.
And Reagan, of all people, if he were here, would tell us as much. In fact, in this essay of yours that I read, which I guess might have been the text of your speech at the National Conservatism Conference, this was in the Federalist, where you're a regular contributor, you even make the point, to paraphrase you, that we ought to be grateful to Reagan for, in other words, for you to make the constructive criticism of the movement that the age of Reagan is behind us and let's stop talking about it is not the same thing as saying that you're ungrateful to what happened there. Quite the opposite. We are descendants politically and ideologically.
We're sitting in the house that Reagan built in many ways.
In many respects, that's right. And yet to honor this house, the Heritage Foundation, to honor the movement, to honor most importantly what motivates us all, self-governance. Our movement must adapt to the times.
Yeah.
And so what are those issues that you think right now are sort of the flashpoints, the issues of tension within conservatism that also will get resolved in ways that have not been clear until recently?
I think one of the biggest issues is how the conservative movement, its relationship with corporate power. I think is a concept I spent a lot of time writing about, and I think is reflected in the big tech debate. I think it's reflected in the concept of the digital economy, and it's interesting even today. How the Republican Party establishes its new relationship with business is something I'm very critical of right now, because you're already seeing some Republicans they just want big business back on their side. Right. And my philosophy is no. Right. These businesses not only hate us, but in many ways, they reflect a threat to freedom and liberty as we understand it. And that needs to be diminished. Right. And a lot of what I've spent time writing about over the last few years is that the conservative movement needs to get skeptical of threats to liberty wherever they arise. And in many cases, that's almost always the government, right? But it's also massive concentrations of corporate power can be just as damaging, and even more so in some respects, than the government itself. And the pushback I always hear to that is, well, Facebook can't put you in jail. Well, they can't, but you know what? Banks are actively, as I just mentioned, debanking people over ideology. Email services will drop you for being a domestic terrorist, and by that I mean protesting your school board. You're seeing even companies like Uber cut people off because they don't like their political beliefs. We live in an age and an economy where the access points to capitalism can be cut off. And that is not something conservatives should stand for. And that will mean aggressively pushing back against not just, woke corporatism, but the structures of the market themselves where they perpetuate wokeness. Because wokeness, in my mind, is tied to scale. And it's tied to the concentration of the market. Where for instance, let's take Google, right? Google is only effective because it filters information for 90% of the world. If Google, whatever they choose to suppress or amplify, changes opinions and information gathering, and the downstream effect of that is voting and learning and all these things. If Google only did that for 20 or 30% of the world, I probably would care a lot less. So again, scale is what matters. Actually, the CEO of Delta was on CNN yesterday or today, and he was saying, I'm proud of the fact that we cut ties with the NRA. I'm proud of the fact that my company stood up and slammed the Georgia election law. And when the anchor said, well, have you seen any impact on your business? He said, no, I see no impact on my business. And why is that? It's because you can't boycott Delta. It's too big. And I think the conservative answer to say, well, just don't patronize this, suggests that we live in a market where huge companies are somehow responsive to tiny market actors. So I don't think it's a practical response for conservatives to say to the busy mom of 4, well, don't shop at Target, right? Because you don't like Target's bathroom policies. Like that's not a response. Yeah,
I would say what I love about that example, of course I hate that's reality, but what I love about that example, the instructiveness of it is that's a really important example for the everyday listener of what you mean when you say the days of Reagan are gone. Mm-hmm. Because in the days of Reagan, it was possible for conservatives to boycott a company that was doing something dumb, that was doing something anti-American. And in fact, they did with great success. But you can't now because of the huge over-concentration of capital in a few hands. Therefore, I'm presuming that you would argue the solution is political. And so what does that look like? In other words, what I'm pressing you a little bit here, but there's violent agreement between the two of us. What does that look like from a policy point of view? Because you've spent more time than most in figuring out how to take these ideas and put them into policy action.
Yeah. So I think there's a number of options. I think from a high level, I always start with radical decentralization, which is, I think, a conservative principle in many ways, but that requires very specific policy actions, the first of which is being critical of how these companies have amassed so much power. So much of the concentration we see in the market right now, it's not the free market, it's a policy choice. It was a choice Republicans and conservatives made to not be critical of major mergers and acquisitions that I would argue we should have been critical of. We should not have allowed Google to acquire DoubleClick. We don't get into the weeds of why. I wrote about it in the Federalist. You can read it there. But in the financial sector, we created so much moral hazard by not really addressing what happened after the financial crisis in 2008. And we've similarly allowed these financial companies to amass so much power that, you can argue, if I don't like Bank of America's policies, I'm going to go to my credit union or my community bank. Okay, that's fine for most people. But what if you're my husband who has a small business? Our small bank can't capitalize the type of loans he needs, so therefore I'm shoved right back into big finance.
This is a real problem.
I'm literally facing this problem, right? And so what do we tell people? And you saw PayPal recently engage in this kind of they had put out a policy that says if you engage in hate speech, we're going to debit $2,500 of your money. And a lot of conservatives were like, boycott PayPal. Well, over 30 million small businesses use PayPal as their primary point of transaction. It's not a solution to tell them to just gut their small business in that way. So whether it's, I think the first step has to be being critical of how this power is amassed and using our antitrust laws, which is law enforcement for the market. I know there's some disagreement among conservatives about that statement, but I think at a high level it's true. The market has to have the rule of law. How you do that is antitrust, so you start there. But then I also think, you're looking into some form of, non-discrimination, public accommodation access in the financial marketplace. You have some conservatives who want to get more specific about speech protocols and association protocols. There's always a danger, I think, when you go down that road, which is why I always start at the decentralization point, because I think I think a lot of the speech and association concerns are actually downstream of market power. If you break the concentration that exists, you break the power of woke capital in many ways, and you allow other business models to spring up, where right now they can't because the market is so ossified.
So we can talk about policy for a long time, but you're a busy person, so I won't do that to you. As I ask you the last couple of questions, they're advice questions for our audience.
And
yeah, I know. So I'd say you're ready. I have to tell the audience, so they're ready. The first is, I'm just going to presume that in spite of all of the reasons to be pessimistic, knowing you some, that you're optimistic that if we're willing to work hard as a movement and confront the tensions inside our movement and the problems in the country, we will prevail. But if that's the case, that is that we will have prevailed by the end of the 2020s, what are the 2 or 3 things that the everyday conservative will have done that makes you optimistic? I'm trying to give people action items.
You mean conservatives in Washington or just general conservatives?
Well, we don't want to engage in fantasy land, Rachel. Yeah, you could take the question however you'd like it.
I am optimistic, I will say. And the reason I'm optimistic is because I trust the American voter and more than I trust anyone else. And I think American voters are always, always, always smarter than politicians in Washington give them credit for. They don't like being lectured to, and they will not stand for it. And so they will demand that kind of change. So I think if we do prevail, the average conservative voter will look far more skeptically at business. I think they will have a far more skeptical response to the sort of foreign wars and entanglements that have driven the country in a lot of ways. They will say, they will ask first, is this in America's interest? They will be, I hope, far more willing to focus on the trades. And that, I think, will reflect the conservative demographic change that's going on in our party. If, this was, I think, spun a lot after Donald Trump left office, that he left us with a different demographic base just based on donations alone, right? You saw the Democrats being made up of far more highly educated, credentialed, white-collar university professors, tech executives, whereas Republican donations were plumbers and truck drivers and homemakers. And so I want to see just a relentless focus on policy for those people. Right? Our party policy has always, at least for the last 30 to 50 years, I would say, has been defined by this idea that if you support the people at the top of the market, everyone else will sort of figure it out. That's not the case anymore. The people at the top of the market are doing just fine. The middle-class family is still struggling. Why? Why is that? And if we as a party are not prepared to iterate specifically on that question and make that middle-class family our constituency, what are we doing? People talk to me about, and this is brought up in the New Right a lot. Well, what does family policy look like? I'm not interested in technocratic meddling with the tax code necessarily, right? What I'm interested in is a policy view that says every policy is family policy. Our tech policy is family policy because our kids are being ruined by, TikTok and Facebook and Google in the classroom. Our foreign policy is family policy because who do you think is fighting these wars, right? Our election policy is family policy. Our economic policy has to be by definition made for families. And so that, I think, if we actually do win this, people will start looking at our politics in that way, through that lens, rather than, how's Wall Street doing today? Frankly, I don't care.
No, we have to get to that point.
Yeah.
And it will concern people who are so accustomed to doing that. But I'm sure when they hear you say what you just said about every policy being family policy, that rings true. Because they know that American communities have deteriorated, that they can cite increased homicide rates as we have done this year. That, of course, is awful in and of itself, but that's a function of something. And that something it's a function of is just the deterioration of the family, the deterioration of the American community. So much of that driven by misguided technocratic policy. So the answer can't be more technocratic policy to fix that.
Well, and this is something I think that's very important to focus on because, you want to get to a point, and I hear this from conservatives all the time, and I share this desire. I want to get to a point where I don't think about Washington all the time. I mean, I do because it's my job, right? But going about my daily life, I don't want to think about politics. I don't want politics in my face all the time. But to get to that point, you have to be prepared to do battle in politics. And that's where the conservative movement isn't quite there yet, because we've always said the answer to these problems is we'll solve them at the local level. But our communities have been gutted, right? Have your neighbor take care of you. Well, my neighbor strung out on opioids and had his job shipped to China, right? Again, these problems are the result of policies in many ways. And so if you aren't prepared to do battle to either reverse those policies or put in, new boundaries to prevent stuff like that from happening, then you're never going to get to that point down the road that we all want to get to. So conservatives have to change their mentality to some extent. We're in a moment where we have to show up and do battle and, use our political power to create this space in which a free people can flourish to be able to get to the end point.
You're so good, Rachel, at articulating action items, which is why I'm glad we also homed in on family policy, something that Heritage is working on extensively. We haven't figured out our specific answers, but all of my colleagues know technocratic solutions are not acceptable. So I'm really glad you said that. But the final question is, it will sound academic, but I mean this to be helpful in terms of the action items. Although you're good, very good at listing the action items, you're also really good at tethering those to our principles, tethering those to timeless leaders, timeless books. And I've been wanting to ask you this since we first met, which I think was on the southern border.
I think it was.
On a Texas Public Policy Foundation CPI trip to the border years ago. Has there been a book, maybe you read it in college, maybe since, maybe before, an essay, that in spite of all of the changes in the country, all of the changes in conservatism, you go back to, whether actually literally rereading it or thinking about, that helps guide your thinking about adapting our particular political program today to the circumstances we find ourselves in?
It's a good question. So I always go back. So actually, my senior thesis as an undergrad was on Edmund Burke. And
no surprise there.
Yeah.
This is with Paul Kengor? With
Paul Kengor. I always go back to Burke because it's what I know. But, I always have also liked the way, I love the way Burke talks about, community and values and kind of the permanent things. But I think Burke, the essence of Burke was really captured by Russell Kirk, right? Who talked about the idea of preserving the permanent things, who talked about one of my favorite ways he phrased this too is that conservatives always have they always have a duty in every age to find the old virtues and bring them back into the light. The creep of progress and modernity is always just pushing those things down, right? It is always trying to edge out the permanent things, to degrade them, to, crash us against the rocks of just alienation. And so I think we as a movement always have to keep in mind what we're fighting for, and that it's not a set of rigid policy prescriptions, it's those principles. It's the things that make life worth living. It is, community and family and nation and human dignity. And those, as a matter of policy, look different in every era. And the last thing I'll say, you and I are both Catholic, but the book American Babylon by Father Newhouse, I always find an inspirational read whenever I feel, distressed in this moment. I'm reminded that, reminder. We are sojourners. This earth is not our home, but while we're here, we're going to do everything we can to fight for the values and the things that we are put on this earth to preserve.
What a wonderful way to conclude a great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Rachel Bovard, where would someone who's interested in reading more of your work go?
So you can always find me on Twitter as the troll at Rachel Bovard. I'm just kidding. But yes, I'm on Twitter at Rachel Bovard, where I post all my stuff. But I write regularly for The Federalist. And you can find my work also on Substack.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining this episode of The Kevin Roberts Show. Obviously, there's much for us to do, but what I hope you heard from Rachel Bovard is that there's hope if we're willing to go work hard for it. Take care, and we'll see you next time.